We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build a decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everybody, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. So I have to apologize. I have a little bit of cold today, so my voice is off, but I have a really interesting guest, so it won't matter. So we talk a lot on the show about wonky and innovative energy tech. And often it's only people on the inside that kind of get jazzed about this. But today's show is different because we're going to talk about the home, or more specifically, how homes are being transformed into virtual power plants. So you don't need to be an energy wonk to find this show interesting. You just need to live in a house. And to me, this transformation of the home from purely a consumer of energy into a producer of energy is the essence, the starting point for an idea we often talk about on Energy Changemakers, energy democratization. So I'm so happy to have with us today Ben Brown, who is the CEO of Renew Home, a California-based company that is not only creating virtual power plants, but also doing interesting analysis about how this new resource is helping avoid use of real power plants. So hello, Ben. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am just so pleased to have you here. I love what you guys are doing. I was thinking, even though a lot of our audience will know the definition already, there are some people listening today that won't know the definition of virtual power plant. So could you just start by giving us a quick rundown of what a virtual power plant is?
I think that the reason why we work so hard to create a definition of a virtual power plant versus the traditional power plant was wanted to use a lot of the same analogies people think about when they think about the grid and operating the grid, where in which you have a natural gas peaker power plant. It has a certain rated capacity. You can rely on it in very specific ways. And so as an industry, when we were coming up with the idea of a virtual power plant, we really wanted to create something that operated almost exactly like a traditional fuel-based power plant that had a lot of the same characteristics, the same reliability, the schedulability, the availability, and could do so in a deeply aggregated, lower cost, carbon neutral way. And I think that's why it was so compelling to think of something like that, because at the end of the day, as grid planners and as utilities, it's really important that we have a reliable grid. We can deliver power in the lowest cost possible way to do so. And when we think about a virtual power plant, we're thinking about hundreds of thousands, millions of homes, commercial, industrial resources aggregated in terms of their ability to shift their energy usage or bring back energy export to the grid. And in aggregate, that can operate just like a natural gas peaker power plant can. And so I think that's an interesting definition for virtual power plant. And when we start to think about what we are also talking about in terms of distributed power plants, it's now taking advantage of the fact that all of those hundreds of thousands of homes and systems are distributed throughout the entire grid. And so now you can start to surpass the benefits of a virtual power plant because you have a distributed resource that can be targeted to provide relief across all components of the transmission and distribution grid.
So a virtual power plant gives you what a power plant would give you without having to burn the fuel, build the power plant, but also has the added advantage of not being centralized, which gives it sort of an increased resilience, right?
Exactly. So when we think about the benefit of the resource, there's a couple things. In a world where in which demand is growing significantly because of all the great activities that are happening on the grid, whether that's new data centers, whether that's onshoring and manufacturing, whether that's the electrification of a lot of fuel-based uses in the home and in commercial resources, the reality is that load is growing significantly. And so we need to build more resources. And the best way to build more resources in the most cost-effective, carbon-sensitive way is going to be leveraging the resources we already have, which is the ability for homes across the country to be able to shift usage in concert with the needs of the grid. And to do so is by far the most cost-effective way, but also a way that can happen today as opposed to 3, 5, 7 years from now.
Right. And we need power now. So that's important, very important part of this. It's fascinating to me, the history of where this virtual power plant concept emerged from. It's not something that was spun out of thin air. It's something that's been evolving for a while, and your company in particular has been evolving it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
We've gone through a journey in the demand response space or the history of conservation space in terms of energy efficiency over the last 30 years to really think about ways in which you could invite the aggregate of consumers and users of power to be able to participate in aggregate to kind of shift their usage and provide a resource to the grid, especially when it needs it in these peak events, which is really what the grid is planned for. And so 30 years ago, a lot of that was very basic one-way communication to switches on HVAC systems or cold storage systems or things like that. And nowadays, obviously, it's advanced tremendously with the real-time telemetry and the interaction that smart home devices and other types of devices that are coming onto the grid can provide. And so the evolution has been pretty tremendous. The two things I would say about it is what the technology has enabled us to do is that it has enabled us to provide an experience that is much more customer centric and really comfort forward. So the advent of the smart thermostat really enabled households to actually be able to both enhance comfort and convenience in the home while actually minimizing their cost. And then when you think about how that interacts with a virtual power plant or in aggregate demand response, it now can do so in a way that provides a resource to the grid without exposing customers to any sort of discomfort at the home.
I'm sitting here looking out at the snow and thinking, this is how old I am, remembering Jimmy Carter, when he was president, admonishing people to turn down their thermostats in order to conserve energy. And I'm just thinking, my God, how far we've come. Like now, the technology is allowing us to achieve that goal without the customer really feeling anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we think about it, it's always been hard to ask for this transaction of sacrifice to a result. And I think that really when it comes to the advent of a lot of smart home technology and also now where we're moving towards in terms of the AI powered agentic future, the reality is there's a lot of opportunity to actually provide enhanced convenience and enhanced comfort while also driving down costs for customers. And so that has actually been a pretty big change in the industry over the last 8 years because when I think about just talking about our history as Renew, which was the group that built up the Nest Learning Thermostat and built up all the grid services and rush hour rewards and energy efficiency programs from the Nest Learning Thermostat. And then we recently spun out of Google about 2 years ago now. The history of that was early days. Yes, Rush Hour Rewards was a very good program in terms of being very comfort centric and comfort forward. But there was kind of this, hey, sign up to do a couple of events a year that would make you potentially a little bit uncomfortable in exchange for a meaningful reward. And that hits a saturation point of the percentage of the population that really wants to participate in that, where, they always have an ability to opt out of an event in real time. They can always maintain comfort in their home, but there is a little bit of a notion of sacrifice. Whereas I think that where we've evolved to with Renew and what we call energy shift capacity is much more of a dynamic, personalized way of interacting with customers that's fluid. So customers opt into shifting energy usage to minimize their costs and maximize their usage of clean energy. But the benefits they get from that are, we always promise that folks will never ever notice or be uncomfortable by those shifts. And so you can provide in aggregate a much larger resource because you have 80% of our users that opt into that. And then that gets into a place where in aggregate, you can have gigawatts and gigawatts of available capacity where users are actually having an enhanced experience because they're reducing their cost, they're maintaining comfort, they have convenience, but now they're providing a really meaningful resource.
It's such a huge change from the old days of demand response when, oh my God, they just turned down my thermostat and it's really hot or cold or whatever, in here. Yeah, so now it's the consumer has just a lot more control. It's much, as you put it, much more consumer focused. Let's talk about the grid challenge and how that's changed. Everybody's suddenly talking about the grid, right? It's in the news almost every day, it seems. So we've moved from managing like a handful of peak hours each year to dealing with more continuous volatility. Tell me a little bit about Renew Home's model and how it responds to this shift in grid needs. How is it suited to the demands of this new grid?
I mean, you really think about the core promise of, just in scale, you think about across the country, the reason why heating and cooling is such an interesting thing to focus in on is that it does represent about 100 plus gigawatts of shiftable potential across the country.
And that's from a recent white paper I think you guys put out, correct?
Exactly. And we mostly just trying to talk about the scale of the existing resource because the reality is that most homes across the US have central HVAC systems. A lot of those central HVAC systems don't actually have smart thermostats or they're not connected to some intelligent system, right? So they're not yet shiftable, but a good chunk are. And so when you think about what is addressable, and obviously us as a platform, we have very much been very focused on really taking a lot of that shiftable capacity from HVAC systems and translating it into a valuable resource for the grid that then drives a lot of value to customers. And so when you think about where we are today and where we're going, because of that size of resource, call it 7 gigawatts of potential, it's a build resource that should be deployed immediately to be able to support a lot of the needs of the grid. And as you just said, those needs aren't just peaking issues. Now, more and more, you have a lot of issues around certain times of the day, certain unpredicted cold snaps. You might have weather that comes in that affects the production of a solar plant or a wind farm. And you just have moments of volatility that weren't necessarily obvious in the way that the grid was planned. And you have to be able to find ways to manage that volatility. And that's why VPPs are just such an incredible resource because it's much more fluid, dynamic with that volatility. And I think that for me, a lot of those benefits are so significant because if you have a system that really understands consumers' preferences, can anticipate their needs, you can actually drive a lot of value back to them and to the grid without any sort of discomfort, any meaningful trade-offs. And you can do so on a consistent basis. So, you can provide a fluid resource for 100 plus days of the year versus 5 to 10 days that are particularly for grid peaking issues.
Very interesting. I mean, it's really a technology. It's having a moment now. Tell me a little bit more about why it's advantageous to be distributed. This is a distributed resource versus if you had a power plant, it's a centralized. What are the advantages around a distributed resource?
There's a couple different things. We've been talking a lot around what the grid was designed for. And, when we think about a lot of the costs that we're dealing with in terms of growth of load and then costs that get passed on to customers in terms of rate updates, there's a significant amount of those costs that aren't just us needing to build new capacity. A lot of those costs are transmission and distribution upgrades that need to be done to support the distribution of electrons from a power plant to a household. And so there's two kind of main benefits to think of. One of which is there's a lot of what we've been riding off probably for the last 20 or 30 years is kind of a margin within the physical infrastructure we have to be able to distribute electrons and just deal with the tolerance of the systems themselves. But the benefit that we have now is that as we're hitting some of those tolerances and we need to update the distribution grid, the reality is the resource that can be used to kind of offset some of this load growth that's happening on the distribution grid is actually in people's homes. And so the distributed nature of the resource and its ability to provide flexibility across the entire grid is exactly where we need it right now. So just building, let's say, a 300 megawatt peaker power plant, that's not going to change the issue that you have certain parts of your distribution grid failing or needing upgrades because of load growth that's happening there. And so a DPP, a distributed power plant, is going to be even more valuable than a traditional power plant because of that exact issue.
So if you do not want more transmission lines built or even power plants, a VPP is helping to avert that. We need more of both of those right now. We keep hearing that over and over again. But if we institute more virtual power plants, we will need less transmission expansion and power plant expansion. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement in a couple different ways, which is in the near term, exactly what you're saying, like they're not equal. A megawatt of distributed capacity that's flexible or can export back is more valuable than necessarily a megawatt of fixed capacity at the transmission grid. And so I think that's one. I think two, the best part about having millions of households, so Renew, just from a stats perspective, we have about 7.5 million households in our platform. We have near 6 gigawatts of load under management in terms of flexible load that is available capacity to be able to provide to the grid.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. And it's by far the largest in terms of residential virtual power plant in the country. And so the reason I mention all of that is because what it also gives you is a sense of where things are going. If you think about the population that are the early adopters of this technology in the home, like smart thermostats, they're also the same people that are going to be electrifying their homes. They're going to be the same people that buy EVs, the same people that buy solar and storage. And specifically the EV equation or updating to a heat pump equation, that's a lot of what is actually driving some of the need for distribution upgrades in certain parts of the grid. So being able to have a better insight and already have households that are participating in a VPP across your local grid and knowing some more predictability around how that's going to evolve over time not only helps you avert distribution upgrades that you need to do now for the next couple of years, but also gives you more predictability around where those upgrades should happen, how you should think about that, because the same population that's helping you manage that is the same population that's going to continue to electrify their homes.
Very interesting. So there are different companies that are doing this same kind of thing you're doing, the residential virtual power plant, but you've taken a little different approach. Can you tell me what differentiates Renew Home in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is because we all come from a consumer product background. We're folks that built the Nest Learning thermostat. We're folks that built the Google Home devices, built a lot of the smart home platforms that people use. And so I think part of that is we really believe that we want to build a platform and an experience that is very customer forward. We recognize that all this doesn't work if you don't have an experience in people's homes that actually gives them more control over their energy bills, more control over their comfort, and enhanced convenience. And so having that background and also actually being some of the folks that have worked on a lot of the large language models for Google and thinking about a lot of the future of the agentic landscape, we feel like we're in a really unique position to help empower households to have more control, more flexibility, and more convenience while reducing their costs, and doing so in a way that is more deeply integrated with the grid. So we start from the home, provide a resource in aggregate by working with homeowners and working with folks. We can provide something that's much more unique, much more reliable to the grid, and we can do so in a much larger way. Because I think the why now versus before, and this question has happened a lot around VPPs, a huge part of it is that it is a scale challenge. So when we think about it, we have been building for 15 plus years. There's a lot of folks, a lot of great folks across the industry that have been working on building demand response programs, really hitting meaningful scale in markets. But the reality is for the grid and where it's at today, unless you're having a conversation with the utility and talking about being able to bring 50, 100, 200 megawatts of capacity and distributed capacity to help deal with some of their load growth challenges, it's hard to kind of have them see you as a really meaningful resource that they're going to invest in and plan around, right? If it's too small in scale, it's hard for you to actually displace some of the challenges they're dealing with and compete against a natural gas peaker. So I think that's one big thing for us that's been very helpful is that because we have such a history of building a very large user base and aggregating so much load under control with our households, that now when we talk to utilities, it's much easier to say, hey, we have 150 megawatts of available capacity ready to be turned on tomorrow. This feels like it's a resource you absolutely need. Let's work together on how we reward customers for it and get it integrated into your system to reduce costs for everyone. And that is a very different conversation now than what we would have had 5, 10 years ago.
Fascinating. Yes, scale. Scale is really the key, isn't it? And speaking of scale, like what are the obstacles to getting more VPPs? Is it just smooth sailing ahead? Are we going to just keep seeing these continue to grow as more people adopt EVs and they become part of virtual power plants? Or are we facing some obstacles that could slow this down?
No, I mean, I think we're in an amazing moment in time where because we can build off of the history of working with lots of households across the country to get them engaged with intelligent energy shifting that helps actually reduce their bills in terms of for efficiency benefits or helps them in terms of ability to use energy when it's cheaper or cleaner. We actually have a huge amount of resource that can provide a lot of value to the grid today that is not fully being tapped into yet. And so I think that honestly, over the next couple of years, there's just a huge opportunity for us as Renew and other folks out there to be able to work with utilities across the country in this moment in time where they need more capacity and they need more distributed capacity and be able to provide that resource to folks to help obviate some of the challenges they're facing in terms of load growth. So I think that's one. So I think over the next couple of years, like really meaningfully, I think we're going to see a massive uptake of virtual power plants being a really core part of the solution for utilities in dealing with some of their load growth challenges and some of their distribution challenges. So I think that's a real thing. I do think for sure there are meaningful barriers on some of this stuff, but actually there's a lot of things that are happening on the policy level, things that are happening from an evolution on the way that utilities are planning and procuring power that I think is actually very helpful in terms of knocking down some of the barriers that have existed in the past. And a lot of those barriers, and to be fair, existed because the scale of the resource wasn't significant enough to be able to be part of the resource planning stack completely. And now that it's hitting those thresholds we talked about in terms of 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts, then it's easier for them to look at it similar to what they would for a peaker power plant.
Very interesting. So it's less about the market having to be redesigned to accommodate virtual power plants and more about virtual power plants scaling to the point where they're meeting the market. Is that correct?
I think that's definitely a component of it for sure. And I think that's will make it easier over the next couple of years for the virtual power plant side of this to be more fully understood and valued and incorporated into the system. When we get to the distributed component of it, that's where I think there's more evolution that's going to happen and needs to happen. Because when you think about most markets in the country, there's a lot of the growth in cost to consumers that is really being driven by needs for transmission and distribution upgrades. And so in my mind, there are definitely more things that we can be doing on the policy side and with utilities to help them benefit from the reality of investing in a distributed power plant on their grid and avoiding some of the near-term distribution upgrades they need to do. They should be able to get value from that because it's going to be a much cheaper option for them and save them a ton of money and save consumers a ton of money. And so that's a mechanism that isn't completely supported yet when we really think about kind of the distribution value of the resource. And there's only so many you've seen that in. So Con Edison's a great example of that, where in which, when Con Edison, we are really seeing huge parts of the way in which they started to structure some of their tariffs being very helpful for being able to value some of the distribution part of the resource. Where in which now that's when the 6 gigawatts of distributed capacity that Renew has, now we can provide even more value to consumers because you're able to take advantage of the fact that the resource is distributed versus just being a couple of big centralized power.
Is that the New York Value of Distributed Energy Resources, VDER?
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple different program structures that we've seen in Con Edison. So I think there's a term DLN program. There's a couple things where in which there are more value because there's certain parts of their grid that is very stressed. And so they're finding to drive and assess value for a locational resource. And there's other parts of the country that have also experimented with components of this. But definitely that part of it, I think, is a huge part of where we could grow a lot over the next 5 years.
Let's go back to talking about the homeowner. I'm really fascinated by the fact that you begin with the customer, because one of the things that I often hear lately is that too often the power industry is focused on the notion of serving the grid rather than serving the customer. And you clearly have started with the customer, but that's not always easy. Like homeowner engagement can be really hard. We're all real busy. We don't pay attention to energy unless our bill is rising and we're worried about it or something like that, or our power is out. So what have you learned about educating and motivating residential customers to participate, and what still needs to change to make participation easier and more mainstream?
Honestly, I really think about it through the lens of when you build a great consumer product, you want to make sure that it is great at doing its job. The main job that a customer is buying it for, and it's so good at doing that job that it's better than what they currently use. As an example, like with smart speakers, when we built those products, we knew a huge part of the use case for that was, it was going to be asking it questions, being able to use far field voice commands for convenience, but a core part of its job was going to be playing music and being able to control that music from afar. And so in order to do that job very well, we knew that you had to link your music service. So in order to create a great experience in home, one of the core parts of setting up that device was linking your YouTube music account or your Spotify music account or your Tidal music account or whatever it was. And so that was such a core part of the experience that we really honed in on that. And similarly for smart thermostats, when we thought about creating that experience, its superpower was going to be, hey, you as a customer are not like sitting at your desk looking at an energy clock of real-time energy prices, truly understanding the thermal model of your home, anticipating weather and kind of the solar radiance of the home over a given day. And so what the superpower of the smart thermostat could do, it could learn the rhythms of your day, it can learn the thermal model of your home, understand the physical components of your HVAC system, and also it could anticipate the needs of the grid and the impact of consuming an electron at 11 a.m. versus 11:30 a.m. And when you incorporate all those things, you can now create a much better experience for the home by incorporating those dynamics versus not. And so when it comes to enrollment and engagement, if you really elevate and incorporate the notion of the superpower of what that device is, and you make sure that customers know what it's capable of by linking the utility account or opting into allowing it to kind of use cheaper and cleaner energy. These become a core part of that product doing its job. And so, historically speaking, we've done a very good job of just making sure and understanding the ways in which a smart thermostat could do its job more effectively by incorporating some of those components in and making sure customers understand that when they're setting up the device. And so that's why we've gone to a place where in which we have nearly 80% of all Nest customers, when they set up their device, opting in to using cheaper and cleaner energy.
Wow.
With
Very cool. It sounds like bringing iPhone thinking to the power industry.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference because the best part about having a dynamic system going forward, in which we think about demand and generation as both being flexible components, whereas before the system was really built around generation being the only thing that you could tune up and down, as opposed to demand being similar in terms of its capabilities. Now you have much more of a partnership between customers and providers. And that's exactly where we need to be going forward to help reduce costs for everyone, which is a huge part of the challenge we're dealing with.
Okay, so let's talk about where we're going. Like, where will Renew Home, where will virtual power plants be in the next 5 to 10 years? What's your vision?
I think that as we continue to empower customers as they're adopting more and more smart technology in the home with elevated experience. So the same thing that we just talked about with smart thermostat, when you're adopting an electric vehicle, empowering that electric vehicle and the way in which you charge the electric vehicle to minimize your cost while still achieving the same outcome of I want it to be 80% charged by 7 a.m. in the morning. I think that's where, if we think about the major loads that are coming onto people's homes, whether that's an EV, whether that's the addition of heat pumps, whether that's potential solar and storage, just making sure that this type of customer first agentic learning experience becomes a core component of how those devices are brought online. You get to this point where you have the potential of hundreds of gigawatts of flexible load that are aggregated in DPPs and VPPs across the country, really providing a majority of the load growth that we're dealing with, and doing so in a way that reduces costs for everyone. Because the thing that people also forget sometimes is that load growth in and of itself is actually a good thing for the economics of the system. Because if you deal with some of the peak issues well and deal with some of the volatility issues well, the reality is that more people consuming power, more electrons, usually should actually drive down costs for everyone. The issue right now is that the ways in which we're coordinating demand and supply are what creates some of these challenges. And that's why we're dealing with continued cost growth. And so if we especially tap into some of the distributed components of DPPs, then we get into this whole world where 100 plus gigawatts of virtual power plants across this country that have locational benefit are driving down costs for everyone. And we're dealing with, we're in a much, much healthier environment than we are right now.
How much do you believe EVs will govern the virtual power plant of the future? Will they be a larger part of the resource than, say, heat pumps or thermostats? Or I'm trying to sort of get a sense of, is this something you're watching carefully, or is it a TBD, or what is the role of EVs?
It's all about different timescales. So I think for the next 5+ years, let's call it the next 5 to 10 years, HVAC and the electrification of heating with heat pumps is still going to be a majority of really helping deal with coincident peak resources, both in winter peaking and summer peaking, and also providing more shiftability throughout the year. But the reality is that as people naturally adopt electric vehicles and are charging those vehicles at home, over time, 2035 and beyond, that becomes a very, very meaningful distributed resource that, when well coordinated, can provide a ton of value in the aggregate level to the grid, and can also provide really meaningful challenges to the distribution part of the grid. So it being coordinated becomes a really important component of what we go from like VPPs to DPPs. And so that's why I think electric vehicles are really exciting, really critical. And the reality is, for us, if you think about it, the 7.5 million households that we have in our platform, they're the early adopters of EVs. We see that we have a really meaningful component of our customers are, a meaningful part of the population of EV owners in the US, and are a huge chunk of the folks that are considering getting EVs over the next 5 years. And so for us, it's really important to think about how that resource can come in and provide value to the grid in aggregate, but also planning out how we think about distribution upgrades and some of the challenges that we'll have in there.
Fantastic. This is so fascinating. Really commend you on your work. This is what we'll be looking at in a few years. This seems to be the way it's all moving. So Thank you so much. I appreciate you giving me this time today.
Absolutely. This was great. It's super fun talking to you, and hopefully this was helpful.
Very much so. Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.